All right, we are live. Hello, everybody. Welcome to Conversations with Non-Catholic Christians. Very catchy title. I'm Kevin Non-Tradicath, and I'm very excited to be joined today by the Dave Pallmann. What's up, Dave?
Doing good. How are you, Kevin?
I'm doing pretty good. I'm excited for today's conversation because you and I are going to be talking a little bit about dualism, mind-body dualism. Um, I'm going to set the stage just for kind of how this conversation came about in like two sentences. And then I might hand it over to you if you'd like, just for a super quick sketch of what actually is dualism and dualism as opposed to what, like what is monism too. So, what prompted this conversation is that I'm in the middle of a video series where I'm reading and responding to Answering Atheism, Trent Horn's 2013 book. Um, very briefly, I was just kind of pointing out in that book. So Trent kind of just made this assumption that mind-body dualism is kind of like where the reader is going to be at. And so I just kind of pointed out, I'm like, well, hey, wait a minute, Trent. The broad scientific community, like the community at large kind of, has more or less rejected mind-body dualism for, a decent amount of time now. And then Dave left a comment saying, "Hey, Kevin, I think you and I should talk about it." For a number of different reasons. I think one thing that you mentioned was maybe scientists aren't the right people to ask about dualism. Like maybe that would be like asking a neurosurgeon about golf, right? The neurosurgeon might not know anything about golf. And then the other things too is you said that I might really like some of these arguments because some of these kind of like dualistic properties might play really nicely with nominalism and maybe even with mereological nihilism. I think that's all the stage setting that I need to do in terms of what brought us together. Did you want to add anything to the what prompted this conversation?
No, just I am enjoying your series responding to Trent Horn, even sometimes where I would agree with Horn over you, but I like hearing your thoughts on it. I enjoy the respectful engagement and kind of the pushing the boundaries forward. But no, yeah, it was just the one thing I was like, well, if the mind's an immaterial thing, then I don't know why we're going to be consulting people who study the material brain to tell us whether or not there's an immaterial mind. But yeah, that's a good way to set up where we're going. So, do you want me to just give a kind of a brief explanation?
Yeah. So we're talking about dualism. What even is dualism?
Right. Yeah. So this is situated within philosophy, what we would call the philosophy of mind, and so it's within that larger conversation. And so basically, the questions there that philosophy of mind's trying to get at is kind of what is the relationship of the mind to the brain, right? Are they the same thing, right? Is it an identity relation? Are these two distinct things? And basically it's trying to understand the nature of what is particularly the human mind, or just what are minds in general. And so broadly, you've got three positions on this, right? You've got the physicalist position, which is going to say that the mind, in some sense, is the brain, right? That there's some sort of identity relation there. You have the dualist, who's going to say the mind is something distinct from the brain. And then you'll have the idealist, who's kind of the opposite of the physicalist, and is going to say, well, no, there's just a mind, or to the extent that there is a brain, that's something that ultimately is going to depend on the mental. Idealism is probably not going to be a big part of this conversation today because neither of us accepts idealism. But so yeah, so what the heck is dualism? Well, as the name kind of implies, right? Dual, we are saying that there are two things here, right? And there's a whole bunch of varieties of dualism, but basically, the central thesis is that there is a material thing, the brain or the body, and that there is this immaterial mind, soul, self, what have you. And then within that, you've got a whole bunch of different ways you could take that, right? So you've got broadly, you've got property dualism versus substance dualism. So property dualism will want to say that there's just one substance, right? But it manifests in two different, or has two different properties, right? It has mental properties and physical properties, which are both irreducible, but they are still distinct. Then you've got substance dualism, which will say that these are two distinct substances, right? And that's what I hold to. So I'll, be defending substance dualism today. And then within there, right, you've got epiphenomenalism, and then you've got interactionist varieties. ways. So an epiphenomenal substance dualist is going to say, well, yes, your mind is something distinct from your brain, but the relationship here is like purely passive, right? Like the causality goes one direction. The brain just kind of generates the mind, but the mind doesn't causally affect the brain or the body in any way. The interactionist dualist is going to go the other way and say, well, yes, the brain can affect the mind, but likewise, the mind can affect the brain. So there's this interaction that happens between the two of them. And there's a few different ways of cashing that out, right? You've got hylomorphic dualism, which will be, popular with probably a lot of the Catholics who watch your channel, because this was, famously defended by Tom, or at least adopted by Thomas Aquinas. A lot of them don't like to call it dualism, but I mean, it's pretty widely, accepted to be a form of dualism. People like J.P. Moreland and Brandon Rickabaugh defend hylomorphic or hylomorphism, and they will unashamedly call it a version of substance dualism. So I'm not quite sure why some Catholics are averse to referring to this as a type of dualism, but in the literature, it's pretty not controversial to call it hylomorphic dualism. Another version would be emergent dualism, defended by someone like William Hasker. So emergent dualism is going to say that the relationship with the mind, in some sense, depends on the brain. It emerges from the brain. And so this, he thinks, accounts for, like Phineas Gage type examples where, you might damage the brain and that damages the mind. He says, well, we can explain that by saying that the mind is dependent on the brain. And then you've got my version of dualism, which is Cartesian dualism, where I think that the mind and the brain are wholly distinct and that the mind can exist without the brain. I won't necessarily be defending that aspect of it, because most of my reasons for thinking that the mind could exist apart from the brain have to do or are theological in nature. But I don't think I need theological arguments to show that the mind and brain are distinct. So I'll just merely be defending substance dualism, but my own position is full-blown Cartesian dualism.
Yeah, and if I recall correctly, mind-body dualism has been so it was really the most popular view on the mind in general from Descartes up until the mid-19th century, maybe late 19th century, because Descartes' I think therefore I am was supposed to be something to the effect of, hey, look, I can doubt my body, but I can't doubt my brain. And I think that was more or less the prevailing idea until, so I didn't actually remember his name. Phineas something. Is that the guy who had the spike driven through his brain? And then
Phineas Gage.
Phineas Gage. See, I didn't remember his name. Wow, you're good. Jeez. But so if I recall correctly, Phineas Gage was like a railway worker in the mid 19th century who had like a spike driven through his brain, and his personality changed entirely. He used to be like a dependable, hardworking, good husband, good father, all that stuff. And then after that, he became like an ornery, like not hardworking, really like just a totally different person. And I think that kind of sent the scientific community in the direction of like, oh, wow, it really seems like these things that we used to attribute to like the mind, this immaterial mind, maybe those aren't attributed to the mind, maybe they're attributed to the brain, something that is like kind of physicalism friendly. Did I get that about right?
I'm not sure if Phineas Gage had that kind of impact on the historical kind of development of philosophy of mind, because honestly the history there is just not my forte. So you may very well be right on that. But yes, Phineas Gage and examples of people like him where affecting the brain dramatically affects the person's mind, those are certainly widely discussed in philosophy of mind, and have certainly done a lot of work towards motivating physicalism.
Cool. Okay. So at this point, I think that we've done a pretty good job kind of setting the stage in terms of like why we're talking today, and also like what the heck is all this dualism stuff anyway. At this point, does it make sense for me to kind of lay out like the problem from conservation of energy as like the main reason why I don't consider myself a dualist, and then maybe I'll kind of like I'll lay it out and then I'll kind of hand it over to you. And if you wanted to either critique it or just offer arguments that you think are just more powerful on the side of dualism, we could kind of go there. How does that sound? Do you want to start with conservation of energy?
If we want to start with the objection, yeah, that's fine.
Okay. If you had a different plan, I'm happy to do that too. I kind of have Very
No, normally I was kind of thinking of myself in kind of the affirmative position, but I think you have an affirmative position too. So I'm really
yes.
okay with going either way.
Okay. So let me start then with the problem of conservation of energy, because the way that I see it is that not only so maybe this isn't super affirmative, but the argument goes something like this: um, since matter energy cannot be created nor destroyed, there is going to be a perfect balance of energy in your brain. That means that humans obey the laws of physics. If humans obey the laws of physics, then all the energy going into the system is going to wind up coming out of the system in one form or another. If that's the case, then there appears to be no room for an immaterial mind. Whatever the mind is, it must be material if it's going to obey the laws of physics. Whenever we study the human body as a, as a system, we see that it does indeed obey the laws of physics. So the human body doesn't break the second law of thermodynamics or anything like that. And because that's the case, it makes it seem as if whatever we refer to as the mind is indeed physical in the sense that it obeys the laws of physics. And so that leads a lot of like the scientific types, the more empirical minded people like me, to kind of take a reductionistic view about the mind. So whatever the mind is, it's the brain. Like, if you drill down far enough, it's the brain. So then that would lead somebody like me to conclude something like there are no minds sans brains, or at least if there are minds sans brains, then they are like vastly different from like what we think of when we think of minds. Thinking of like a computer here, like if there's some kind of computer brain, that's whatever that thing is going to be, it's going to be very different than like an organic brain like the ones that we have. But that is essentially it's an interaction problem at the end of the day. It's saying that because the mind it appears to be causally inert, we're just going to shave it off with Occam's razor. So that's kind of the PCE, the problem from the conservation of energy.
Okay. So I should make a couple disclaimers first before kind of responding to why I don't think that this is a successful objection to substance dualism. So first one being, I'm glad you kind of mentioned that you're an empirically minded person. I think you've called yourself before an empiricist, or as close as you can be to one without being one.
Yes.
Yeah. So I'm a rationalist, right? I'm very much a Cartesian, and so which isn't to say I don't, care about empirical evidence, right? I don't think that's the only way of knowing things. And so what most of my arguments for substance dualism are, there are empirical arguments for it. People who want to talk about split brain thought experiments and blah 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 blah. And I've just always found the rationalistic Cartesian arguments much more interesting myself. And so kind of because of that, because I think like these rationalistic arguments yield a greater level of certainty than an empirical argument, because that's just going to inherently be probabilistic. Kind of if the two were to come into conflict for me, it's always going to be the rationalistic argument that wins out. So the disclaimer here is, even if conservation of energy was a problem, because I think my rationalistic arguments are going to hold, I'm just going to say then we're wrong about something here. So that might seem closed-minded to some people, but that's... Sorry, go ahead.
I was just going to say that I think that like the admission that like, hey, no, that does seem to be a pretty powerful argument. I just have more powerful arguments on this side. Like, so I'm not taking away from the evidence right here. I just think that the evidence over here is stronger. I think that's like a really cool place to be in, because it's like you're honest enough with yourself that you're saying like, yeah, no, that is good evidence. It's just not as good as the other evidence. And so I'm not going to diminish that evidence. I'm just, following the stronger of the two. I just think it's kind of cool. I like it.
Yeah. Well, yeah. So that's kind of, I guess, our epistemological difference there, and for perhaps maybe that explains to some extent why we're coming to the conclusions that we do. The other disclaimer is that I'm not like a science guy. I have like the basic high school knowledge of it, and then maybe a little more on top of that beyond the average person. So I'm going to do my best here, but you're the guy with the degree in is chemical engineering, right?
Yeah, that's right.
So.
Notably,
Yeah,
though,
so
not neuroscience.
you may
So notably not neuroscience.
Right.
That's important.
Well, But you're better equipped on these sorts of issues than I am. So like I said, I'll do my best here. I'm going to be relying on a lot of experts here, but like if you got objections to what my experts are saying, I might not be able to offer a rebuttal to that. So, that's where I'm at on this. But okay, so first point that I'll say in response is at best, this conservation of energy objection is going to be an objection to an interactionist version of substance dualism. So, like when somebody like myself, who is going to want to say that the mind can causally interact with the brain, causally interact with the body, and supposedly this is going to involve the creation of new energy. So it's an objection to that sort of dualism. But if one is like purely epiphenomenal about their dualism and they just think that the mind sort of emerges from the brain but doesn't, causally interact the other way, I don't think it's going to be an objection to that sort of dualism. But because I am an interactionist, right, we can probably put that aside. It's just I find it helpful to kind of limit the scope of how far does this go. Is this an absolute defeater for dualism? Well, no, at best it's a defeater for the type that I hold to. But okay, so to the meat of the argument then. I think you're correct that it's a species of the so-called interaction problem for dualism. And from what I can see, the argument has got these two key assumptions in it, right? So the first being that conservation of energy is an absolute law, which always holds. And then the second being that interaction requires an energy transfer, or always requires an energy transfer. It seems to me that both of these assumptions could be challenged on empirical grounds, and so I'm going to be relying heavily here on a paper that Robin Collins wrote called "The Energy of the Soul." So, in his opinion, general relativity falsifies that first assumption that conservation of energy always holds, like as an absolute law. What he said. Well,
sorry, go ahead. No, take it away.
Go ahead.
So I was actually just going to kind of quickly jump in and agree with you that conservation of energy is actually not an absolute law. So it's funny, like a lot of people will try to talk about the conservation of energy with regards to the cosmos, and you simply can't do that. Like the conservation of energy is something that only applies in closed systems. So if you have a closed system, every single time that we've measured a closed system, energy has been conserved. Full stop. That is the case. That's just empirically the case. However, we have no idea if energy is conserved on a cosmic scale. So it's not an absolute law. It's only a law for every single closed system that we've ever measured. And human beings are indeed closed systems. So, it's a little weird, but.
So the first point, right? I think I can then skip the first quote I was going to read from Collins because you do agree that well, it's not like he said we don't know, though, that is. He actually argues that we know for sure that conservation of energy is actually false on a global scale. So here's his example, and I'll bounce this off you. He says, quote, "This non-conservation of energy in general relativity is exploited in contemporary cosmology. For example, as the universe expands, the waves of each photon are stretched, and hence the wavelengths of the photons become longer and longer, a phenomenon known as the cosmic red shift. Since the energy of a photon is inversely proportional to its wavelength, photons with longer wavelengths have less energy. Finally, since the vast majority of photons in the universe, those composing the cosmic microwave background radiation, are not significantly absorbed by matter, the total number of these photons remains almost constant, except for an almost insignificant contribution from starlight. Yet each is losing energy, and the energy is neither going into matter nor anywhere else." So he argues it's actually empirically false that conservation of energy always holds. You agree?
Yeah, so the only thing that I want to add here is that, and again, not a physicist, so please take all of this with a grain of salt, but my current understanding is that a lot of scientists kind of look at this data and they think like, oh man, I really wouldn't be surprised if there was some kind of anti-energy. Because a lot of scientists actually think that the total energy balance of the cosmos is zero. And so everywhere that we see energy, there's actually like an equal amount of anti-energy. And so there's this idea that there is some kind of cosmic balance. It's not so unbalanced as we think it is, but we haven't found any yet. And we also haven't found antimatter yet. So the idea that there is some kind of balance is very much so unproven, which is why I said unknown. But all of that is is kind like it's very speculative, and I wouldn't like hang my hat on the total energy balance of the universe being zero. Um,
Okay.
so, but pretty much broad agreement.
Okay, so if we agree then on that sort of that first assumption that conservation of energy is not always doesn't always hold, it seems like then the argument becomes, but it does hold in closed systems, and then human beings are closed systems. Could you explain to me why that doesn't beg the question against the substance dualist? Why? Because if let's say, for the sake of argument, the soul does involve the creation of new energy, which when I address the second assumption, I'm going to give some reasons for thinking that I don't think it's true that mind body interaction has to involve an energy exchange. But if we said, for the sake of argument, that it does, wouldn't it just be question begging then against the substance dualist to say, well, human beings are closed systems?
So no, you can actually measure whether something is or is not a closed system. And all that you do is you like look at the amount of energy going into the system and then watch the energy as it leaves the system. If the amount in is always the same as the amount out, it's a closed system. When we measure humans as a system, that is the case. So anytime that you eat food, you're going to get energy from that food, and the amount of waste expelled from the human body plus the amount that you sweat and the amount that your metabolism consumes and the amount of muscle that you build, all that stuff is going to be exactly equal to the amount of energy in the food that you ate. So that's something that's empirically verified. So I don't think that's question begging, because it's not like we have to assume that the energy in and the energy out are the same. We measure them and we see that they are indeed the same. Does that make sense?
Well, I think it does with respect to like the particular example that you gave of like eating food, but I don't really think any substance dualist is saying that the mind is like involved in that. Like we're happy to say that like the body carries out those sorts of functions mechanically. I think it's going to be more an issue of like our voluntary actions. Is there any way to verify that we are closed systems in that case?
Still, yes, because any kind of voluntary action that we would require would upset the energy balance if we were not closed systems. So, if you voluntarily decided to lift a weight, there's some amount of force that you are applying to that weight, and that requires energy to bring the weight off the ground up to to complete your exercise. That amount of energy would be unaccounted for in our energy balance if we were open systems, but it's not unaccounted for. We've measured this, and we are indeed closed systems.
Okay. Like I said, I don't have the expertise to take that any further. So I'll leave it at that. That we do have agreement that that yeah, conservation of energy doesn't always hold, but there might be some reason to think that it does. Well, there is reason to think that it does in closed systems, and then there might be some reason to think that human beings are closed systems.
Right. And so Nick is kind of going here. So does the soul make the human an open system? And what I was trying to just, what I ineloquently just said is that we can measure a system and see if it's opened or closed. And when we measure humans, we do balance energy every single time that we measure it. So that's, yeah.
Okay,
Not,
yeah,
not,
and
go ahead.
okay. But then the second assumption here, right, is that the second assumption is going to be that interaction always involves energy exchange. So Collins goes on to argue in the same paper that quantum mechanics, and I know you don't, I know your antenna goes up when people bring up quantum mechanics, but he argues that quantum mechanics falsifies this assumption as well. So he says, quote, underlying the energy conservation objection is the idea that causal interaction requires an exchange of energy. Even apart from the considerations based on general relativity in the last section, this idea is deeply problematic within contemporary physics for an independent reason. Specifically, quantum mechanics, the cornerstone of modern physics, provides a good case of interaction without either energy or momentum exchange. In quantum mechanics, there are law-like correlations between attributes of distantly separated particles without energy exchange. These quantum correlations, therefore, show that positing an interaction between the mind and brain that does not involve an energy exchange or any other mediating field has precedent in current physics, and this severely weakens the energy conservation objection. Your thoughts?
I think what is being discussed here is something called spooky action. Uh, Nick just mentioned quantum entanglement. Spooky action is quantum entanglement. So there's this phenomenon that we've observed where we can actually take two particles, and particles have spin. It's not important what spin is, just particles can have positive or negative spin. Um, and there is such a way that we can make sure that those two particles always have the same spin. So if this one has positive spin, this one will also have positive spin. If we change this one to negative spin, this one will change as well. Then we can separate them by a vast distance. It seems as if distance doesn't matter. And whatever we do to the one, the other reflects with appearingly no like exchange of energy between the two particles, which is super strange, and hence the name spooky action. Um, and yeah, like we really have no idea what to make of spooky action. Um, Quantum entanglement is like super strange, and I frankly don't understand it. Um, I think most people don't understand it, if I'm being honest. Um,
Yeah,
but
I don't either.
yeah, I I'm quite happy though to kind of. Oh, and Colin actually just anticipated where I was going with this. Um, so I'm quite happy to kind of give you some thoughts on that if you're ready for some thoughts.
Oh yeah, I was just thinking the basic objection here is that you don't necessarily have to have energy transfer in order to have interaction. So you could still have conservation of energy within closed systems, and yet still say that the body and soul interact, or that the mind and brain interact with one another, and that this doesn't involve an energy exchange. Maybe it just involves the mind sort of guiding where the energy goes, directing the energy in some way. So yeah, do you think that yeah, given that sort of defense, if you can have interaction without energy exchange, would this not be a defeater to the objection?
Yeah, so I think that this is the best way that I should say it. It defeats the objection on the quantum level, but it does not defeat the objection on anything above the quantum level. And here's what I mean by that. This is where it's going to get weird. So try to, and I'm going to do my best to kind of put this in terms that are easily understandable. So, um, quantum physics is almost like an entirely, not almost, it is. It appears as if rules are just different on the quantum scale than they are at anything above the quantum scale. What do I mean by that? While it is true that this spooky action seems to disobey the laws of physics, if we zoom out to any scale higher than quantum, all of a sudden the laws of physics are being obeyed once again. It's super weird and we don't really understand it, but the laws of physics that are non quantum laws hold at non quantum scales. Okay. Hopefully that like mostly made sense. And that's what Colin was saying here too. Quantum only works on immensely tiny levels, not on the level of neurons. So what is the quantum scale? We are talking about quarks. Quarks make up atoms. Atoms make up molecules. Tons and tons and tons of molecules put together make up a cell. A neuron is a kind of cell. Neurons are, I don't actually know this to be the case, but I'm sure that neurons are billions of times larger than quarks. So to put things into perspective, if I was an atom, if I was the nucleus of an atom, a football field away would be the closest electron shell. Larger atoms have multiple electron shells surrounding them. So we're talking many, many football fields away. So and a quark makes up one proton, which is like one of me. So the scale that we're talking about here is just so vastly different that it's actually hard to understand. And the scale that biology operates on is not quantum. The scale that biology operates on is macro. So biology does obey the laws of physics. So, but I said at the beginning that this kind of does defeat the objection, but all that the soul would be able to do is, like, for instance, change the spin of a certain quark.
So I don't think the point that Collins is making there is that the interaction is happening at the quantum level. I think he's just saying that quantum mechanics provides us with a precedent for the idea that interaction can happen without an exchange of energy. So I don't think he's saying that the interaction is happening, you know, yeah, but between the quarks or whatever. I think it's more that this just shows that you don't have to have energy transfer in order to have interaction.
Yeah, and the thing is that that's kind of false for anything that's not quantum. Is the whole point that I'm trying to make here? Is that um,
Okay, but but what would be the argument for then that you could, if it can happen at the quantum level, that is, you can have interaction without energy exchange? Why think that this would be the only place that it could happen?
because of the empirical evidence? Whenever we measure systems, the laws of nature are such that energy is conserved every time.
Yeah, but what we're positing here is an interaction without energy exchange. That's the point. So the point is that you can still
Oh,
have
oh, oh.
conservation of energy and yet still have mind-body interaction without energy transfer.
Yes. So the mind body interaction would be limited to only like quantum scale events if this was the case. Like if there could be interaction, sorry, um, if we are only limiting ourselves to interactions that do not cause a problem for the second law of thermo, then we are limiting ourselves to quantum scale interactions. And quantum scale interactions have no impact on human biology.
So maybe you already explained it. I'm not saying why it is why it's limited to only this area.
So if the idea here is, hey, look, we can have interaction without energy exchange, and here's an example, it's quantum physics.
Right.
Then how about the mind is doing exactly that to the brain and to the body and all that stuff? Um,
I don't think it's doing exactly that. Like I don't think it's doing exactly what's going on at the quantum level. It's just that, hey, look, here's a way you can have uh, interaction without energy exchange. So maybe something happens like this between the mind and the brain.
yeah. So if that's the idea, then what I'm saying is that the only kinds of interactions that we can't, so these kinds of interactions that cause changes that do not obey the second law of thermodynamics simply are quantum interactions. So if the idea here is that the mind is interacting with the brain on like a quantum scale, um, that appears to be unfalsifiable to me and also would appear to have absolutely no impact on like a macro scale interaction. As soon as we hit the macro scale, it's simply not true that you can have an interaction that disobey, like, that does not have energy transfer.
Okay, why is that you think that you couldn't have a macro level interaction without an energy exchange? I guess
And
that's the part I'm not seeing.
yeah, and this is the part that science, I don't think is going to be able to give you a clear answer on this right now, other than to say that is simply like how it is every single time that we measure it. Whenever we measure interactions, there is always energy transfer, except for quantum interactions. And so that's why the quantum thing kind of needs to get like, I kind of have no choice but to cede the quantum thing to you and say like, yes, spooky action, sure. But otherwise, uh, the empirical data is such that all non-quantum interactions require transfer of energy.
Yeah, I don't see any way that that could possibly be known, right? Like if there is a immaterial and non energy sort of interaction happening between mind and brain, this is not the sort of thing you'd be able to measure. So I guess I don't know. It seems like we're saying if we can't measure it, then it's not there, and I guess I don't see that that follows.
Yeah, so I think that the question that scientists would want answered is something like this: what exactly is the mind doing to the brain that is, because it appears as if we have no need to posit the mind because this energy system that we have kind of explains everything already. So like if we do have some kind of um, action, some kind of interaction that's going on, and it's not breaking the laws of thermodynamics. What is that interaction? Like, I think that's the
Maybe it
question.
involves like a what if it involves like a sort of guiding or a directing of the energy? What do you think about that?
So energy can only flow in one direction. That's just like a law of physics. There's never a point where like energy can go this way or it can go that way. Energy is going to go wherever energy is going to go. And if it goes in the wrong direction, then what we have there is a breaking of the laws of thermodynamics. Think about a battery.
Okay.
Yeah, a battery is exactly what I just explained. We are preventing the energy from flowing out of the battery until we take that little salt bridge and we connect that little salt bridge, and now the electrons can flow across the salt bridge. And now that battery is charging your Game Boy. Um, so we are um, it's not possible to change the flow of energy without us knowing about it, kind of. As in, what I mean by that is, if the second law of thermodynamics is being obeyed, then there's only one way for the energy to flow.
Okay. Yeah. All right. Then I'll just accept it as there's a question there for the dualist of what is the nature of the interaction, or what is the mind doing with the brain. But we could say it is then possible for interaction to happen without energy transfer. It just becomes mysterious in that case what the mind is doing. Is that a fair place to leave that one at?
Yes, if we are positing this mind that interacts with the brain, but we are saying the mind doesn't break the laws of physics, then what we're saying is the mind interacts with the brain. We're not really sure what it's doing, but it's not breaking the laws of physics, whatever it's doing. That's kind of, I think that's where the dualist would kind of have to be on the whole interaction problem. That, as far as I can see it, anyway.
Okay, yeah, I'm happy to leave it there. With not that we exactly have a necessarily a defeater for dualism here, but that there is at the very least, an unanswered question.
Yeah, and I'm not going to stay here long, but just kind of on your like, hey, that's not a defeater for dualism, and you already said this. None of what I just said speaks to a non-interactive form of dualism at all either, and I really have no defeaters for a non-interactive kind of dualism other than like an Occam's razor kind of like, well, hey, look, I don't think that, like, if it's not interacting with anything, then it's causally inert. And like, if it's causally inert, then I'm just going to kind of not posit it, I guess, which isn't really a defeater. It's just kind of like, hey, I guess I'm going to ignore it.
Well, maybe we could say if it's unnecessary. If it's an unnecessary thing, then I think you could shave it off. But I think if the arguments that I'll give for dualism, if those hold, we would have reason to hold to a soul or a mind, even if it was causally inert.
Yeah. And just so that I understand your position too, and I know that you're kind of playing for multiple teams right now, but the dualism that you hold is interactive, right?
Yes, the
Cool.
Cartesian
Yeah,
dualism that I hold to is
yeah.
an interactionist version.
Cool. Okay, cool. I think that we've more or less, killed and buried the whole uh, problem of conservation of energy. I'm happy to kind of hand it over to you at this point, and like maybe,
Okay.
yeah, take it away.
Okay, yeah. So, let me maybe begin with a thought experiment of sorts, or even before we get to thought experiments, right? Maybe just sort of bounce some questions off you to see where you're at on some of the kind of premises in this argument. Well, let's begin with something pretty not controversial, right? So, we could probably agree that we have non-veridical experiences, right? Things like dreams, things like hallucinations, where we maybe have a visual perception of something that doesn't actually correspond to anything in the physical world, right?
I'm on board. Yes.
Okay. So now we can maybe make it a little more extreme, right? Maybe all our experiences, right, are, not veridical, right? We could imagine it's possible, right, that we're the victim of some kind of mad scientist, right, who's got you unconscious, right, in his lab somewhere, and he's got you all hooked up to his machines and his chemicals, and he's doing the right things to give you kind of the conscious experience that you think that you're having. This seems possible, right?
I
Or
can't disprove it.
yeah,
Yeah.
something like the Matrix, right? Brain in a vat.
Mhm.
So we got these kinds of scenarios. Now let's make it a little bit more extreme, right? Let's go all the way that Rene Descartes did, right? When he was thinking maybe, kind of this world that I feel like I experience just isn't there at all, right? Maybe I'm the victim of this evil Cartesian deceiving demon, right? Does that seem possible to you? This kind of skeptical scenario?
Yes, it seems like something that I cannot falsify. Yes.
Okay. So if these sorts of things are possible, right, then in epistemology, right, we're gonna take a quick detour to epistemology, right? Skeptics will try to use these sorts of scenarios to be like, well, look, this means you can't know anything, right? And so one kind of response that Cartesians like myself have taken is, well, hang on, even in these sorts of scenarios, there are certain things that I can know, right? Right, the cogito, I think, therefore I am. I can know that I'm having these particular experiences, even if they don't correspond to reality. I can know the definitions of words, right? I can know that there are no married bachelors, right? Even if I'm kind of a victim of the Cartesian demon. So even in this sort of scenario, there are still things that I know, right? Just like I know them in the actual world. All right, so if we kind of have agreement on that, then we're in a position to make the argument, right? Basically, the idea here is that some of our knowledge is immune from error, even in these kind of crazy skeptical scenarios. But if we can still know these certain things in this scenario, then this means we can know these things in the absence of actually anything physical existing in the kind of Cartesian demon scenario. And so if we can know these things in the absence of anything physical existing, then those items of knowledge cannot themselves be physical. Otherwise, we wouldn't be able to know them in the absence of anything physical existing. And so therefore it would just follow from that that our knowledge cannot be something physical. And so then at least some aspect of us, namely these items of knowledge, can't be physical things. What do you make of that sort of argument for substance dualism?
Yeah. So, I'm gonna do a little bit of struggling out loud here, so you're just gonna have to like bear with me, I hope.
Go for
but
it.
but so I recall a conversation that I had with Dr. Jim Madden. He's a Catholic philosopher of mind. Um, and him and I were talking about the laws of identity, non-contradiction, and excluded middle. And you mentioned the law of identity as something that we can know, like even kind of like just like baseline. Like we know that there are no unmarried bachelors. I actually don't think that we can know the law of identity in this kind of super skeptical scenario. I accept them axiomatically, but I don't think that we can know them. However, I don't think that this actually impacts your argument. And the reason I say that is because this kind of doesn't affect the cogito part, like the I think, therefore I am. And this is kind of where I'm at with the hey, I can doubt everything except for the fact that there's somebody thinking kind of thing. And that's this. I think that I have to accept that there is something because I can have a reductionistic view of the self. So like, me as the mereologically nihilist, I don't think that Kevin per se exists, but I do think that the simples arranged Kevin Wise exist. So I think that what I am forced to do is admit that there is at least something that exists that is capable of doing this exercise. So at least there exists like one mereologically simple entity, and that one mereologically simple entity is capable of doing the whole doubting my existence thing. Um, I think I'm more or less like forced into that um, admission. I don't like that term admitting, but I think I have to recognize the fact that there is at least one mereologically simple entity that's capable of doing the doubting. Um, but that does seem a little bit distinct from admitting to some kind of dualism. Does that make sense?
Well, what I want to say is, do you think that this simple thing that's capable of doing the entity or capable of doing the doubting, can that sort of thing, is that compatible with the existence of nothing physical existing?
Is the existence of the meteorologically simple entity compatible with the existence of? Oh, yes, I do think that I can't, like, in this hyper skeptical scenario, I don't think that I can like really hold on to any kind of like monism. Like, I think I have to become agnostic about dualism and monism and say like, hey, look, like there's at least one kind of thing, but there might be more than one. And if I kind of strip away everything and if I start to doubt everything, I don't think that I can hold on to monism. Is that about how you
But
phrase?
see, yeah, but the point I've tried to make is that it remains the same both in the hypothetical world where there's nothing physical existing, right? In this completely skeptical world, this item of knowledge that you have, that remains identical in both worlds, right? Both in the actual world and in this hypothetical world. And if it remains identical and it's not physical in the skeptical world, then it also cannot be physical in our world because that's just what it means to be identical. So if it can be non-physical, then it must be non-physical, and so therefore it follows that there is a non-physical part to you. That's Descartes, or as I interpret him, that's Descartes' argument, and that's kind of Swinburne's reinterpretation of his argument.
I'm so sorry to do this to you, but I'm very dense. Can you pretty much walk me through that again? Particularly the if it can be non-physical, it must be non-physical.
Sure, we're saying that this item of knowledge, which you would possess in either world, right? One where there's absolutely nothing physical, and one in which the world that we think that we live in, the world which is physical. There's this item of knowledge which remains identical in both worlds, right? Which is whatever. I exist. I think, therefore I am. I'm having a perception of a conversation with Dave right now, right? Any item of knowledge you like that will remain the same in both worlds. If it's the same and it's non-physical in the skeptical world, in order to be the same, it will also have to be non-physical in the actual world. So if you think that these sorts of skeptical scenarios are possible, then it's a tacit admission that you have actually acknowledged a non-physical part of yourself.
Yeah, I suppose I'm not entirely sure how we get from the um if it could be non-physical, then it must be. Because what stops somebody from kind of taking some kind of reductionistic view of the thinking process? And it's like, hey, whatever the thinking process is, it is something physical that this mereologically simple entity is doing, and that's the only thing in the cosmos that's actually happening. But this, like, why could not somebody be reductionistic about this one mereologically simple physical thought?
So I don't know that I'm saying that they couldn't be reductionistic about it. I'm saying that in the skeptical world, though, ex hypothesi, right? By hypothesis, that is not what it is, right? By hypothesis, in this world, it's something that exists, and for which there is not a in I assume by reductionist you mean physical explanation. We're saying in that world that is not the explanation for it. And so if you think that that is really something that's possible, that you could still have this item of knowledge even in a world where absolutely nothing physical existed, then it can't be a physical thing.
Oh, I see. Okay. Okay. So I think that somebody who is holding to non-dualism would just have to say that a universe where nothing physical exists simply like isn't possible, because then you're saying like it's just a universe where nothing exists, and then somebody would have to say that's not a universe at all. That's just nothing. Right?
Or they could try to say maybe that sort of world is logically possible, but you couldn't know anything in it.
Oh, true, true. Like it's a possible world. It's just there would be nothing that could have the experience of being plagued by Descartes' demon or something. Um, Yeah.
Right. But that really bucks up against the intuition, which, we naturally have, which is that no, those sorts of worlds are possible, that I still could know things in the absence of anything physical existing.
Yeah, let me kind of think out loud again, and I want you to step in and tell me where I'm like if I'm misunderstanding. But I think that the thing here is that the person who rejects dualism kind of needs to say, yeah, that intuition that we all have about it being possible that like there could be some kind of non-physical mind that is plagued by like Descartes' demon or whatever, like that is actually not possible despite your intuition that it is possible. Right? Like that's kind of best case scenario for
That I
the
think is the best way out, but then you have the notoriously hard problem of showing that a car like you have to basically show that direct realism is not only true, it's necessarily true. Like that there actually has to be a logical contradiction in a Cartesian demon scenario, and to my knowledge, no one has done that.
would it not be enough for the empiricist to kind of say like, hey, look, in light of all the empirical evidence that we seem to have about, you know, no minds existing sans brains and stuff like that, I'm like, I've got the empirical evidence on this side and then I've got this intuition on the other side, and in light of the empirical evidence I'm going to have to decrease the credence in that intuition. Right? Is that what somebody would more or less have to do? Uh-oh, I
Things are
lost it.
possible.
Ooh, Dave, I lost the last little bit of what you just said. I
Uh
might.
oh,
Yeah,
am I cutting out?
little bit, little bit. Oh, it was getting good.
Okay, am I back?
Yes, I hear you. You're choppy, but the visual doesn't matter as much as the audio.
Okay. Okay, yeah, as long as you can hear me, I could turn off my camera, worst case, if that's just slowing things up. Maybe I'll turn it
Yeah,
on in a minute here. But, yeah, if you can still hear me, yeah, that's the main
loud and
thing.
clear.
Okay, sorry. Where did you lose me at?
So I pretty much lost you from the moment that you started talking. So I left it at I think that the person who wants to deny dualism is probably going to have to like decrease his
Oh, yeah, weigh empirical evidence.
yeah, and the person who's rejecting
Okay.
dualism kind of has to say that intuition that I had, I need to kind of say like, hey, yeah, that it's just a false intuition.
Yeah, and I would say I don't think it's just an intuition here. So I think we've got more than an intuition going on. I think it is very intuitive, right? And so that's why I kind of began. I'll admit it. I began by priming what I suspected was a strong intuition on your part to try to trap you. But I do think there's more than an intuition there. I think that we are actually acquainted with the fact that there is just not a contradiction in that, type of scenario. I think we actually, know that this is not that this is something that is possible in virtue of it not having a sort of a contradiction. The thing about empirical evidence is that the skeptical scenario can just duplicate that, right? You could have that same sort of empirical evidence, exactly the same as you have it now. You could have that in the Cartesian demon scenario. So I
Yeah,
don't see why that would be like I don't see that that would override it.
yeah. So yeah, So be
Basically, the point would be that evidence that is consistent with either hypothesis can't be evidence against one hypothesis or for one over the other if both hypotheses entail it, which both do in this case.
yeah, yeah. So is it almost like the non-dualist kind of just has to take it axiomatically that like we like um that we are not brains and bats?
So what they could say is, well, I mean, I think that they would have to. They basically have to say it's not possible for you to have knowledge in a skeptical scenario. So, in virtue of the fact that you do have knowledge, like you're not in a skeptical scenario, and basically this just entails like you have to defend that direct realism is a logically necessary position.
And we love you, Braxton, and the entire Trinity Radio team. Sorry,
Yeah, I would say that could be Pritchett Prime
it
too.
could be Pritchett Prime. It sure could be. But I don't know if Pritchett would actually admit to loving me. He would say something like
That's true.
he would say something like he's a good guy, but man, he needs to tuck in his shirt more. That's what Pritchett would say.
Yes, yes, you would.
But sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off. It's just when I saw the Trinity Radio team in here, I wanted to make sure I said hi. But um
No, you're
yeah.
good.
So the person who's holding to monism, like a physicalism, a non-mind body dualism, pretty much has to say something to the effect of, "Yeah, I'm taking it axiomatically." And I I think I heard you say something like they have to say that it cannot be the case. And let me ask you this: do you think it's possible that they could say, "No, it could be the case, but I'm going to presuppose that it's not the case"? And then after I've made that one presupposition that we are not brains and vats, then at that point we uh we reject dualism. What do you think about that?
I think it's more than that. You have to say that I cannot have the mental states. I see. It's Braxton.
I knew it. I knew it. He said he loved me. I knew it was Braxton. Sorry, I
You
keep on
you
cutting
you
you
know
off.
them so well.
I do.
No, you're good. No, but I was gonna say I think that it's more than they can't just say that a skeptical scenario is not the case. I agree with them that a skeptical scenario is not the case. It's that you could not have the same kind of sensory experiences. You couldn't basically have the same items of knowledge that you have in a skeptical scenario. They have to say that that there's some kind of logical incompatibility between you having these sorts of experiences and these items of knowledge and being in that skeptical world. It's not enough to say, I am not in that world. I agree that you are not in that world. But as long as it's possible that you are in that world and you could still know something that you know in this world, and those items of knowledge are the same because of that identity relation, if it's immaterial in one world, it will be immaterial in the other world.
I think I understand. Um the non-dualist just has to say like, yeah, um not so not only do I think it's not the case, but it cannot be the case because I've already
Yeah.
said that dualism is false. And like
Yes.
that kind of situation, like the Descartes demon situation, is only it can only exist if dualism is true. If you're admitting that this situation is possible, you are admitting that dualism is true. Therefore, if you are saying that dualism is false, then you must say that Descartes' demon not just isn't the case, but cannot be the case.
Yeah.
And that,
That's a very, yeah, in my opinion, that's a very difficult hill to climb.
yeah, it's going to be super uncomfortable because it kind of goes against our intuitions.
More than our intuitions. I think it's. I just think we know it's unless you can show a contradiction in it, it's logically possible.
Yeah, so just real quick, I was thinking about like I said intuition, I think a few times, and I think that you've jumped in a few times. You said like, no, I think it's worse than that, Kevin. It's not just an intuition. Is it almost something like this? Like, I think what you're saying is almost, and please correct me if I'm wrong, because I would never want to put words in your mouth, but it's something like, Kevin, it's not just an intuition. It's like your lived experience. Like you are experiencing this thing that is telling you that Descartes' demon is possible. And so you have to be telling yourself that the experience that you're experiencing is just like not the case. Like you're not experienced, like you're not directly something like that.
I don't know if I'm saying anything quite that extreme. I'm just saying that if something doesn't contain a logical contradiction, then it is logically possible by definition. I think we have a clear enough concept of our own experiences. We have a clear enough concept of what an evil demon would be like. And so while we do have an intuition, we've got more than that. We've got our own ideas that we know about these things, and we can put them together and a contradiction doesn't arise. And if you want to start saying, well, maybe there is a contradiction that we just haven't realized, but like I don't have a burden of proof to point out to you where the contradiction is, that's just going to completely skew our reasoning, like our modal reasoning in general. Then like literally anything, any hypothesis, like any scientific hypothesis. You can't prove that there's no contradiction in there anywhere, right? It's just if we don't detect one, then we assume that there's not. And so in the same way, if we don't detect a contradiction in the Cartesian demon scenario, then we're not going to assume one's there.
Yes. So I'm struggling out loud a lot today. So, but you're being very patient with me, so thank you. Um, so something like this. So you could see my brain like short circuiting. So
No, your mind.
there you go. But so you said something to the effect of like science would go out the window if we said that anything that doesn't have a contradiction could like it would still be impossible until the evidence proves that it's the case. Um, and
Well, no, it was more that if you think that a hypothesis, or if you don't have to show that there's a logical contradiction in order to assume that one is there, because right, if you're going to say, I can't tell you what the contradiction is in the Cartesian demon scenario, but I'm just going to say it's logically impossible, we can do that about literally any hypothesis, right? We can say, like quantum mechanics or general relativity or any scientific theory you like, we're going to say, well, there's a logical contradiction in there. Pff, I don't have to tell you what it is, you know?
yeah. Yeah, that's like a very skeptical position. Okay, let me kind of like throw something at your wall and see if it sticks. Um, so there's this hypothetical guy who's totally not real, whose name is Kevin, and Kevin is a person who rejects dualism, and he thinks to himself like, okay, um, Descartes' demon is definitely like troubling, but I am going to do something like this. Um, I'm going to look at the empirical evidence that seems to favor that like dualism's falsehood, and then weigh that against the Descartes demon scenario. Kind of remain agnostic, but lean towards the empirical evidence, and just say like, I can't point to a problem in Descartes' demon. However, um, in light of these two, like, all the empirical evidence says that one is, uh, the empirical evidence points one way, but we have this thought experiment that points the other way. And so I'm going to wind up kind of picking one and leaning towards it, even though like I'm agnostic per se on the matter. What do you think about that?
Yeah, and this might go back to kind of the difference I highlighted before between the empiricist and the rationalist, right? So for the rationalist like myself, the empirical evidence is all compatible with the Cartesian demon hypothesis. You could have, like, maybe that's even part of the deception, right? Maybe the Cartesian demon gives you these perceptions of this empirical evidence just to fool you into thinking that, dualism is not true. So, for the rationalist, the thought experiment is going to come out as the stronger of the two, because this, in my view, is giving us the kind of rational certainty that empirical evidence just in principle can't provide. Empirical evidence at best is going to give you something that's probabilistic. But in this case, you've kind of got, like a global defeater for any empirical evidence you could ever have. No matter what empirical evidence you ever had, it could always be given to you, I feel like, by the evil demon. And it's not going to do to appeal to that to be like, hey, the Cartesian demon scenario, that's not possible because look at my empirical evidence. We could always say, he could have given that to you. So that's my rationalist answer to kind of the empiricist response.
Yeah, and I mean, I guess the empiricist could do something like yeah, rationalists. That's right. The empirical evidence really could be all I'm really am a brain in a vat. The empirical evidence is not really there. I'm imagining it, but it really doesn't seem that way to me. And so I'm like, or I almost kind of just take this axiomatic, like this I take it axiomatically that I'm not a brain in a vat, and then after I've taken that kind of axiom, now the empiricism really does seem to carry the day, something like that. Like, what do you think about all
I
that?
think I think you'd have to add the further axiom too. If we're going to just go axiomatically, then you also will have to take the axiom that a Cartesian demon scenario is not even possible. Because as long as that's possible, the dualist argument is going to go through. So it's more than just that this isn't actually the case. It's that this actually cannot be the case. So you'd have to add more than an
Yeah.
axiom that I'm not in that scenario. It's that I couldn't be in that scenario.
Right, and that's what we were talking about earlier too, where it's like the person who's like the person who is rejecting dualism has to say that Descartes' demon presupposes that dualism is true, so Descartes' demon cannot be true because I've already said that dualism is false. Like they're kind of
Right.
for
And then
yeah,
the question, of course, right. And then the question, of course, becomes, well, why can't it be true?
yeah,
Because there doesn't seem like there's a logical contradiction in it. Certainly, intuitively, it seems right to, the vast majority of people who have reflected on it. There doesn't seem to be any reason why this couldn't be the case. And if you're going to say, well, I just don't think it could, then, immediately there's going to be questions about, well, are you just begging the question in kind of your whole
yeah,
epistemology and assuming that you're directly connected with the physical world? And if that's the kind of approach we take to epistemology, I can justify any belief. So it's almost like bye-bye to critical thinking at that point, if that's kind of the route somebody wants to take.
Well, I wouldn't say that it's bye bye to critical thinking as much as it is like hello to a couple axioms, right? Because the person who is being the empiricist here isn't actually giving up any critical thinking once you've reached empiricism, right? Like,
But I think I can do that for anything, right? Like I could just make my axiom, well, the Bible's the word of God, and then like I can reason, I can employ reasoning from there, but say, but that's my axiom. And the issue there is that if we're just allowed to employ, well, there's a basic arbitrariness concern that I can include anything I want as a axiom, and then, well, I can critically reason from that axiom.
yeah,
You're still going to be able to get anywhere you want.
yeah. Um, we're straying a little bit with this question, but like while we're on axioms, I've said some things about axioms that I kind of want to like throw at you and see what you think. Um, I've often said something to the effect of like we should um posit as few axioms as we need to actually like live our lives. Um, and so what if somebody said like so what if somebody was thinking like, hey, I ought to posit as few axioms as necessary in order to actually live my life. Hey, I think that I need to posit that Descartes' demon is false because otherwise I could like walk out into the middle of the street and like, hey, that car's not real, it's not going to hit me, but it is going to hit me. So like I'm going to just posit that that's not the case. Um, but then that's like that one baseline the axiom of don't have more axioms than necessary would actually prevent the axiom of like I'm just going to assume that everything in the King James version of the Bible is like exactly the word of God and like perfectly true in all ways. So like, what do you think about something like that?
Well, I mean, so from my view, I don't, think that we should, depending on what you mean by an axiom, right? If an axiom is an unjustified belief, then I'm just going to reject those wholesale. I don't think we should hold any unjustified beliefs.
Ooh,
Uh,
sorry, go ahead.
yeah, I'm very much a Cartesian, so I try to build up from foundations which I absolutely cannot be wrong about, to inferences which I could be wrong about. But I like to at least have like a truth directed trajectory in my beliefs. I don't want to like be building a castle on sand. I want it to have a firm foundation. So I agree in principle that we should have as few axioms as possible. And for me, the answer there is just going to be none. I don't want an axiom to the extent that it's an unjustified belief. Um, what you said something though about adopting an axiom that they're just not in the Cartesian demon scenario. Again, I'm fine with that. I don't believe that we're living in the Cartesian demon scenario. The dualist argument isn't saying that this is the case. The dualist argument just needs it to be possible that
Right.
this is the case. So I'm fine with you having, the belief that I don't live in that scenario. What I'm more, I'm going to have more of a problem with is a person who says, but that couldn't even be the case.
I've got a question for you. You said that you have no axioms. So what do you make of like the logical laws, for instance? So like the laws of identity, excluded, non-contradiction, and excluded middle.
Okay, I will need to back up a little bit and talk about kind of, so I'm a foundationalist, right? I think that there's two types of beliefs. We have the beliefs that we infer from other beliefs, and then we have the beliefs which we don't infer from other beliefs. And so the question there is kind of what justifies those beliefs, because it can't be an inference from a further belief. So are you familiar with, well, you know about Bertrand Russell, right?
Yeah.
Do you know about his theory of knowledge by acquaintance?
I don't think so. When I say that I'm familiar with Russell, I mean like Bertrand Russell had the teapot, right? Um,
Yeah.
and like that's it. Like that's like all the Russell that I know.
No, you're good. But no, Russell was a foundationalist of the sort that I am, and so his view on how we came to have these non-inferential beliefs was what he called a direct acquaintance, which he took to be a relation which held between the mind and a thought, a property, a fact of some sort. So maybe to get an idea of this in your own mind, something like when you have a headache, right? You've got like this intense pain. You don't really go through a process of inference to figure that out, right? You're just kind of immediately connected with that fact. Well, that is what Russell has in mind when he talks about knowledge by acquaintance. So this is what I think is justifying, the belief that I'm having this particular visual perception right now. I'm acquainted with that fact, right? If I hear someone open the door, I'm acquainted with that audible fact, right? And so this is how I think we get. And I would also defend that this is an infallible justifier of beliefs. That's controversial, but that's my own view on it. So now applying this to logical stuff, right? Your question. Logical laws, what are they? I take them to be propositions about other propositions, right? So the law of non-contradiction, right? Two contradictory propositions can't be true at the same time and in the same sense. I think in the same way that I'm acquainted with, the experience of pain or with a visual perception, I'm kind of acquainted with the concepts in my own mind which make up that proposition. So I know what it means for something to be contradictory. I know what it means for something to be true. I know what it means, to say at the same time. I know what it means to say in the same sense. And so this is what philosophers would call an analytic proposition. It's true just in virtue of what it means, sort of like I know that all bachelors are men. It's part of what it means to be a man, or part of what it means to be a bachelor is to be a man. So just actually by knowing knowing basically the concepts in that proposition and the relations among them, that's how I know that that proposition is true. I think the same things hold for logical laws. Sorry, that was a really long-winded
No,
answer.
no, no. It was good. Um, it sounds empirical to me because it's kind of like saying like, hey, it's just like this, like empiricism is like sense perception, and this almost sounds like it's just like no, I'm just like I'm sensing that it is the case that like a thing cannot, there cannot be an unmarried bachelor. It almost it.
Yeah, I think it works for the empiricist, but it also works for the rationalist because I don't think we're just acquainted with sensory things. We're also acquainted with conceptual things, and so
Yeah.
that's why I classify myself as a rationalist.
And so, um, would you uh would you say, hey, I don't think that I am a brain in a vat. I don't think that I am afflicted by, a demon
Yes.
because okay, okay. So here's a question for you.
Well, so yeah, it's an inference for me. I make an inference to the best explanation, and I think realism is
Oh,
a better explanation
so no,
than a Cartesian demon.
I was actually going to ask you if like you were almost accepting the fact that like it's not like you are not a brain in a vat for the same reason that like you're just kind of like directly like aware of the fact that um the law of identity is true and you're kind of just directly aware of the fact that like you are not a brain in a vat. Um
So I wouldn't see. I don't think I am directly aware of the fact that I'm not a brain in a vat. So for me, an inference is involved in getting beyond my own mind, right? I know by acquaintance with these sensory perceptions that I have. But these sensory perceptions are compatible both with me being a brain in a vat, being a subject of a Cartesian demon, and with the idea that there's a real external world there. And so then I want to say, okay, what's the best hypothesis here? And in my view, far and away, the simplest hypothesis is that I'm experiencing a real world of three-dimensional objects.
yeah. Um And so I guess my empirical brain is getting in the way a little bit here. So I'm going to ask a question. This might be like a dumb question, but um how are you like directly aware of like the law of identity if it's not the same way that you're just directly aware of the fact that like you're not a brain in a vat? Um
Right. This goes back to the idea that the notion of acquaintance, right? That we can be directly connected, right? Like that you have a headache, right? Go back to the headache example. You're directly connected with this fact, right? You're not making any inference. There's no chain of reasoning where you have to arrive at the conclusion that, think of yourself like you don't see yourself going like in the mirror, I think I have a headache. Like you just know it immediately. The same thing I think is going to hold with our concepts, right? So, law of identity, a thing is itself, right? Any particular example of it you want to go with, right? Like I am myself. I'm going to take my concept of what I am and my concept of, myself, and I'm going to realize these are the same thing. They correspond to each other. So I'm acquainted with each aspect of that proposition and that correspondence relation which holds between them. And I'm a correspondence theorist when it comes to truth. So what is true just is what corresponds to fact. So in this case, I would say I'm acquainted with all relevant truth conditions of that proposition. And that's why I can't be wrong about it.
We don't have to spend any more time here if you don't want to. But I'm still, and again, this is probably just like my engineer brain getting in the way of, philosophy, but I guess I still just don't know how one can be directly acquainted with something like the law of identity. Um,
So I have a video on my channel about this. It's called The Justification of Logical Laws. I go into a bit more detail there and cite some of
Okay.
the philosophical literature. It's kind of, if it's something that you want to explore further, I kind of have it in like an essay format there on my channel. I can even send it to you if you like, but it is a bit off topic.
Okay, cool. I'm happy to leave it there for now. I have one question for you myself, if you don't mind, and then there's been a bunch of questions that came in the sidebar. If you don't mind tackling some questions from the audience before we wrap up.
No, I'm good.
Cool. Okay.
Yeah.
So,
Although, yeah,
oh, go ahead.
well, I'd say we do also do want to talk about some reasons that might appeal to
Oh,
you based on
completely
your
forgot about that.
Platonist or based on your nominalism, and yeah.
You know what? Why don't we go there right now, if that's all right?
Okay. Yeah, we don't have to spend a lot of time here. There are arguments for dualism based on sort of the role it can play in questions like problems of universals, one over many problems, basically the sort of things that Platonism is invoked for. And then there are also arguments for it based on mereological nihilism. And since I know that you're both a nominalist and a mereological nihilist, these are arguments that I thought would appeal to you. So one of them is going to be that our own immaterial concepts can do the work of Platonic objects, right? So why do people think that abstract objects exist? Well, a big job that they're supposed to be doing is sort of explaining categorization, right? So kind of there's this universal of dogness, right? And it explains in virtue of which all dogs are similar to one another. Well, an issue there is that's pretty gratuitous, right? We really want to think that there's this Platonic realm of these causally inert abstract objects. And then there's an epistemic access problem, right? Like how in the world could we know about these things? But it seems pretty obvious that we have immediate access, epistemic access to the concepts in our own mind. If you're a dualist, you think these things are immaterial, sort of like the Platonist thinks that abstract objects are. Why can't we just say that we have a concept of a dog and that all, particular instances of dogs that we observe are subsumed within that concept? That way I have the means for categorization, but I don't have to appeal to this, metaphysically gratuitous Platonic realm of abstract objects, and I don't have to overcome the epistemic access problem. So these sorts of puzzles that people want to posit Platonic objects to do, I don't see any reason why I can't do all of that with an immaterial concept in my own mind. So what do you think of that?
I like it, and let me kind of ask a clarifying question, I think. So, is each individual concept of a dog or a banana or whatever, would each individual concept be it would be concreta, it would not be abstracta.
Yes.
And so in this way we are completely avoiding the universal of dogness. We're just saying like, no, you right now what's in your mind is this individual concept of a dog.
Hmm.
And like, I might have that also. Like, I might have a concept of dog in my mind as well, but those are going to be two examples, like two concreta that are both these concepts of dogs, but still no universal needed.
Yep, that's exactly what I'm saying. You
Yeah.
can have just concrete objects, and you can have them doing the work that Platonic objects are able to do. But part of that work that an abstract object is supposed to be doing is due to its immateriality, because it's supposed to be things like multiply instantiable and stuff.
Yeah.
So I'm preserving the immateriality of that via my dualism, and so that way I'm able to get the same work done, but I don't have to run into epistemic access problems, and I don't have to posit this kind of gratuitous ontological baggage in my worldview.
I like that. It's kind of like under this frame we are able to like assume all of the benefits of postulating these universals, but we don't actually need any of the baggage that comes with postulating universals.
And we don't have to like go the fictionalist route either, right? Because I don't have to say, well, I'm just talking as if numbers are real, or I'm just talking as if red is really a thing. Like, we don't have to say that these are just useful fictions. No, we can say that there is really something there that we're talking about, but it's a concept in our own mind.
Yeah.
We don't have to go out there to find it.
Yeah, yeah. I find that a lot more like satisfying than I find it a lot more satisfying than like a Platonic realism, but I find this even more I find this also more satisfying than like a more moderate realism a la Aquinas. Because
Yes.
I guess if I was going to rank these things in like order of which I like them, like Platonic realism would be like my least favorite, and then like a moderate kind of Thomistic realism would be like my second favorite, and then this kind of this conceptual nominalism is definitely my
Yeah.
favorite out of those three. Cool.
Yeah, I've tended to call it non-divine conceptualism, because there's a lot of people who will argue that, like, well, yeah, these universals, they kind of exist, but they're concepts in God's mind. But that still has some of the same problems, like the epistemic access problem. And like, if we're going to say concepts are enough to do it, let's just say they're our own. So that's kind of I call it. I call myself a nominalist. I think it works with nominalism. There are some people like William Lane Craig who disagree with me. He calls it psychologism, and he says it's a version of realism. But anyway, that's kind of my take on that. But it depends on my dualism. And so anyway, I was like, hey, maybe he'll like this.
I hope that you sleep easy at night, knowing that you are a heretic and that the Roman Catholic Church in years past would burn you at the stake for being a nominalist. It's disgusting. I'm just kidding. But okay, cool. Yeah, I no, I like that a lot. I think we also said something about how dualism and mereological nihilism also kind of play nicely together. Did you want to add anything
Yeah.
about that?
Sure. Yeah. I'll just briefly. This is an argument that I got from Dustin Crummett,
I love
who's a
Dustin
crazy
Crummett.
smart guy, by the way.
Yes.
Yes, but he's a mereological nihilist and he's a substance dualist. And his argument goes something like, and I myself am not on board with the mereological nihilism at this time. I'm not strongly opposed to it. I think there are some interesting arguments for it. But, basically, and for people who aren't aware, mereological nihilism is basically the denial of, what's the right way to put it?
Composite objects.
Yes, that's the word I was looking for. Composite objects.
Mm-hmm.
So basically, it's just going to say that some kind of particulars, is all that exists, and they are kind of shaped in different ways. Well, if that's really true, right, that's going to apply to your body too, right? So if you are just your body, and mereological nihilism is true, this kind of has the implication that you don't exist.
Yeah, you per se do not exist. Yep.
Right. And so, but that seems kind of wrong. And so if we want to preserve the idea that we exist, but we are still attracted to the arguments for mereological nihilism, as I think you are, well, dualism provides a pretty good solution right there. You can still exist as a immaterial particular because you're something that's distinct from your body. So that's kind of how you can preserve your own identity while being a mereological nihilist, which it seems like if you're a physicalist, you don't have a way to do that.
Yeah, I guess would you almost exist in the same way that the concept of a dog exists? Like does would this, like, if we adopted both dualism and mereological nihilism, does that almost mean that like whatever you are is kind of conceptual? Like you are a concept
I
almost?
would say it's immaterial, and I take concepts to be immaterial things. So in that sense, that both would be immaterial, I would say yes.
Okay. Yeah. And I guess we have no way of knowing under this kind of mereologically nihilistic and dualistic framework. We have no way to kind of like classify all these different immaterial things. Like we might postulate these concepts, and then we might also postulate these like selves or these like persons or whatever. But like, there's really no way for us to kind of differentiate between a concept and a person, right?
Um, well, I mean, a person is going to be so like concepts are not going to be causal, presumably. At least if you're an interactionist dualist, you might still think that persons are causal. So there would be some differences there.
Yeah, I guess. Yeah. Okay, cool. Did you want to say anything else about either like mereological nihilism or nominalism?
I feel like I've been talking your ear off already. I'm
No,
sorry
I
about
love
that.
it.
I know
I
you want
love
to go
it.
on to questions.
Um, I've got one question for you, and this is kind of like, I think it's like a good question for me to end on. The audience has a couple questions that I'm going to pull up, but my question for you is something like this. So, the hypothetical person named Kevin um, finds the argument from the PCE, the principle of conservation of energy, to be like quite convincing, but then he also is like, I have to like I need to understand that I might need to say that the Descartes demon scenario is actually impossible, and that seems to conflict with like, it just doesn't seem impossible, but I'm gonna have to say it is anyway. What do you do? Like, this totally hypothetical, not real person. What do they do? Did I like there seem to be good arguments on both sides.
I'd say if you have a rationalistic certainty that comes into conflict with an empirical probability, the rationalistic certainty has to win out. But then, moreover, I think we did come to a resolution that the conservation of energy argument that you gave doesn't rule out all sorts of dualism. Maybe you could be a purely epiphenomenal substance dualist, right? And say, well, there is an immaterial mind. I know that from these Cartesian demon arguments, but based on conservation of energy, it doesn't interact with the body. And so in that sense, you could kind of accept both.
Yeah, yeah. I guess that makes the like epiphenomenal dualist nominalist in a funny position, because you are shaving off all of these abstracta with Occam's razor, partially because of the interaction problem. And then you're looking at like, at dualism, and you're like, man, I really want to shave it off, but I'm trying to preserve this intuition that Descartes' demon is possible. And I'm going to do that
But
through, you know what I mean?
the difference there, though, I think is going to be that when it comes to abstracta, you've got issues such as that you don't need them to do this explanatory work, and you've got epistemic access problems. This version, you're saying I need it because look, there's arguments for dualism, and it doesn't have those problems. So I do see the point, right? You want to shave off unnecessary things, but maybe it turns out that this isn't necessary, and hey, I get some of the perks that I could have had, with Platonism without incurring the ontological cost.
Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense. Cool. I like that. That was the one question that I had for you. I'm going to scroll back up over here because there was a bunch of questions. And guys, if I miss some of your questions, I'm sorry. Feel free to put them at the bottom of the chat again. But first question comes from Colin. I'm wondering how Dave differentiates between all logically possible scenarios. Just to set the stage, this was while we were talking about like, well, Descartes' demon is logically possible, so it the person who denies dualism
Yeah.
doesn't get off so easy.
I'm not completely sure what he means by differentiates between logic, like differentiates between all of them. It's going to be in virtue of them having like different properties or different features about them, right? Unless he means to ask how we differentiate between what's logically possible versus what is not. I guess I just don't find the question all that clear.
Uh, Colin, if you want to clarify, go ahead, but I'm going to do my best to clarify right now. So I think that Colin is asking, and this came before the discussion about um like the knowledge that we can gain through inference. And I think that what you said was um your belief that Descartes' demon is false is an inference. And so this question I think came in before all that. So
Okay.
I think that the question is kind of like, okay, like, you could be brain of that, you could be plagued by Descartes, the demon, or both of those could be false, and the world really could be as all of those are possible. How
Okay.
do you determine which one is actually the case?
Yeah. Okay. Okay. How do you adjudicate among different logical possibilities
Yeah,
as to which one is true or most likely to be true?
yeah,
Yeah, and I mean, I'm an evidentialist, so it's going to be on the basis of the evidence. Which in the case of those hyper skeptical scenarios, I'm going to appeal to abductive principles of reasoning, which I think are justified kind of a priori in the same way as logical laws. That would be my answer.
okay, okay, cool. I've got another one from Colin. How do you differentiate between conceptual knowledge through acquaintance and intuition? And that's a good question. I think I echo that question.
Okay, yeah. So to some extent, it's going to depend on how we're defining intuition. But if we're going with the definition that somebody like Michael Humer or somebody like Russ Schaefer Landau gives, an intuition is this sort of non-propositional desire, or maybe not even a desire, but kind of this tendency to accept a proposition as true, which accompanies a proposition. So, sort of like if you reflect on the proposition, I have hands, and that sort of seems right to you, right? You find yourself inclined to accept that proposition as true. To the best that I can understand these philosophers, that is what they mean by an intuition, is when you reflect on the proposition, it just seems true to you. And so, as a result of that, you find yourself sort of prone to accept it as true. That's what they mean by an intuition. What I mean by acquaintance is something different. Acquaintance is not this sort of tendency or this proclivity or this disposition that accompanies a proposition. It's a relation which holds between your own mind and whatever it is you're acquainted with, right? So that can be your own sensory perceptions, it can be your visual perceptions, audible perceptions, it can be ideas in your own mind, even an idea that you think is false, right? I think you can be acquainted with a false proposition. So that's going to be a big difference between an intuition and acquaintance, because you can't have an intuition. Well, you could have an intuition that a false but what I mean here is a proposition that you regard as false. You could be acquainted with a proposition that you regard as false, but you couldn't have an intuition that a proposition which you think is false is true, right? So, or at least you couldn't, without having additional reasons for thinking that it's false. Does that clarify it sufficiently?
Yeah, and is this almost a semantic thing where it's like a lot of people might actually say intuition, what they mean is like conceptual knowledge through acquaintance? Is that like possible?
I think there are people who don't have these concepts kind of in their own mind. In the epistemology literature, it is a well understood distinction,
Okay.
because, like, I read papers between people like John DePoe, who's an acquaintance theorist, and Michael Humer, who's a phenomenal conservative, who's he's an intuitionist in his epistemology. They all write papers firing back at each other. So these are distinct positions, but at a certain people who maybe aren't as up in that literature, then yes, I think that there could be a lot of talking past each other.
And your parents are epistemologists, right? The doctors McGrew.
Oh, I wish.
but they are Dr. Lydia McGrew and Dr. Tim McGrew. They are epistemologists, right?
Yes, they're specialists in
Yeah,
epistemology.
I know that they do work in like textual criticism. Well, they might not call it textual criticism. They might just call it like history, or I don't want to,
New Testament studies.
there you go, New Testament studies. And I'll share. I actually am far more familiar with their work in New Testament studies than I am with their work in epistemology. And I'm not very familiar with their work in New Testament studies, which says that I'm not familiar at all with their work in epistemology. But yeah, anyway, that was just all a joke to say that they're your parents, which isn't even that funny. It sounded funny in the moment. Okay.
Yeah, you originally had me as like son of Lydia, right?
I did Dave, son of Lydia. Um, I find the McGrew jibe just to be so funny, and the way that you've just adopted it as your own. You're like, yep, I'm a McGrew What's to you? I love it. Um, okay, so another one from Colin. So this is like a two-parter. So all you can say with that is that we have a direct perception of the laws of logic, and then he added by a demon. So I think what Colin might be asking here is something to the effect of like, um, how do we know that your direct acquaintances aren't also coming from a demon?
They could be, right? But the point would be the point of acquaintance is that it is a direct connection to a fact. So even if the demon is causing the acquaintance, uh, your corresponding belief is still going to be true, right? It wouldn't even matter at that point if the demon is causing the acquaintance relation, because acquaintance is an essentially relational sort of thing, which the direct point here is important, right? It means we're not getting there through fallible steps. It's a direct connection between your mind and the fact, right? And so it's because of that directness that there's no room for error. So if the demon is the one who's directly connected you to the fact, you're still connected to the fact. Just to think about it this way, if I'm having a thought about a pink elephant in my mind, right? Even if a demon placed it there, I'm still having the thought about a pink elephant in my mind. That's just that level of infallibility there when you've got that unmediated connection to these sorts of things. They're transparently before your own mind.
Is a headache an example of something that you can like directly perceive in that way? And if so,
Oh yeah.
could a demon make you think that you have a headache when you really don't? Or is what it
I don't
is
think so, because
is what it is to have a headache just the idea that you have a
yes,
headache is
what it
having
is
a
to
headache?
have a headache is to have the experience of a headache. You can't be wrong. You can't think you have a headache and then not really have one, because a headache is not right. Like take a person's phenomenal experience out of it, but keep like their physical brain, right? Whatever's causing them let's say it's a brain tumor or whatever that's causing them a headache. Take their phenomenal experience of pain out of it. We don't say that they have a headache in the absence of that. The
Yeah.
headache just is that experience of pain.
Yeah. So somebody can experience phantom pain from from an injury that's not real. Like somebody could think that their arm has been chopped off and they feel like pain and they'll say, "Oh, I'm in pain. My arm was chopped off." You might look at them and you say, "Your arm isn't really chopped off," but you're not going to tell them your pain isn't real. Their pain is real, even if the thing causing the pain isn't what they think it is. Like it's your direct.
Or another example. Yeah, to take another example, right? If you like go to the hospital, right, because you've got this really bad headache, and the doctor examines your head, and he's like, "It's completely normal. You don't have a headache. A Cartesian demon is making you think you have a headache." That's nonsense, right? That's what the headache is. It is the experience of pain. It's not some external thing that you could be mistaken about.
Yeah, yeah, no, yeah. I thought that I had something with the headache thing there, and then as soon as I said it, I was like, wait, no. What it is to have a headache is just to think that like thinking that you have a headache is having a headache. So,
Yep.
um,
Mm-hmm.
and Colin adds, I see his point now. So, good work. um, there was a couple of things that I wanted to highlight. Daniel said something. If there is an evil demon, he's given me a pretty fun life. So good. Maybe this demon's not evil. Maybe he's a completely
Benevolent demon.
or at least neutral. He's given some people bad lives, but hey, he gave Daniel a pretty good life. So this demon, he's not evil. He's misunderstood, is what this demon is. He's just misunderstood. um, let's see. Dave the Brahmin said, Kanon's argument, as in conservation of energy, is the strongest I've ever heard on the issue, other than perhaps the knockout studies and their analogs. I'm not familiar with the knockout studies, but I do share Dave the Brahmin's assessment of the energy of conservation, of the argument from conservation of energy, the PCE, the problem of conservation of energy, or the principle of conservation of energy. I find that one real convincing too, which says nothing about.
I say I find it. Yeah, I find it interesting as an objection to interactionist dualism. Again, I'm not the science guy, so maybe I don't have feel the force of it the way I should. But in some ways, it just seems obvious to me that my my consciousness interacts my actions. But it's seeming obvious to me, and me being able to explain that in a scientifically sophisticated way, of course, are two different things. I tried to read up on it for this conversation.
No, yeah, and I do think that the paper, because I think that I've read the paper that you referenced. When did it come out? Like a couple years ago now? Like was it like 2018 or something like that? Um,
I think this one was 2011. Let me look it up
okay.
real quick.
It doesn't. It's not a big deal.
Yeah,
It's
2011.
okay. I think I've read it, and because when you were explaining it to me, I was like, I don't think this is the first that I'm hearing about this. Um, but yeah, I do think that. So I'll just kind of share my own, like, hey, reflect on the conversation that you just had, Kevin, which is so difficult to reflect on something while you're still in the experience. But anyway, um, I, I, I would say that I find the argument from conservation of energy like equally as convincing as I did when I started this conversation, but I find the whole Descartes thing a lot more convincing now than when I started this conversation, which is like uncomfortable because I have like these two ideas that are like in tension with each other, and like they both can't be right because they're mutually exclusive of one another. So now I just have this like weird feeling of just being completely uncertain, and it's all Dave's fault. So thank you, Dave. um, I
Well, if it's any comfort to you, well, I'm not less confident in dualism. I do think that you gave me stuff to think about, at least with the
cool.
conservation of energy objection.
Cool. I think I got to all the questions. There was a lot of chatter in the sidebar, but most of it was like not questions as much as it was some funny statements, and some chatting among themselves. So I think I got to all the questions. If I missed anybody, sorry, but I've kept Dave. Oh my gosh, it's been an hour and 40 minutes. Wow. Dave, let me not keep you any longer. I had a blast. Thank you so much for doing this with me. Did you want to end on any kind of note? And also tell everybody
Well,
where we can find you and all that.
well, the last point I was going to make is there's a lot of people think that this is kind of bound up in like the theism atheism debate, this dualism thing, and it really doesn't have to be. If I became an atheist tomorrow, I would still be a substance dualist, probably not a Cartesian dualist who thinks that the soul can exist apart from the body, but I would probably adopt some kind of emergent dualism where the mind emerges from the brain. Some of the best defenders of substance dualism that I have read are ardent atheists, right? Richard Fumerton, one of my favorite philosophers, has a great book defending dualism. Evan Fales, one of the most formidable atheists I know of, and is a strong substance dualist. So, like, there are great defenders of substance dualism who are atheists. So it's not like if you're an atheist you have to be a physicalist. And conversely, there are weird Christians who are physicalists too, and I don't understand that. But the point is that this doesn't have to like be a make it or break it thing for you on that particular issue. So yeah, you can feel free to kind of investigate it while keeping your other beliefs intact. Like, you don't have to suddenly become a Christian or a theist in order to accept substance dualism.
Yeah.
With that, yeah, that's the end of my pitch there. If people are at all interested in me, I do plan on doing a video series on this at some point. It would be on my channel, Faith Because of Reason. You're actually going to like the next video that I do, Kevin, I think, because it's going to be a long, very long critique of moral arguments for theism and why I don't think that they're any good.
I've been seeing all the books you've been reading, so I'm excited for that one. I'm excited. You're gonna get flack from other Christians on that one, but I know you're ready for it. You don't care, but you're gonna get the flack. And hey, the only thing that I kind of want to add to this was I likewise enjoy kind of giving people the freedom to explore things. So like when you just said like, hey, look, this really kind of has nothing to do with the theism atheism debate. I like that approach. Like, I like ending on that note because we're trying to give people the freedom to explore this without having to change their other beliefs. But I also do kind of think it's important to also say like, But if that wasn't the case, then like, all the worse for the theism atheism debate. You know what I mean? Like if that's not the case, well then these arguments still either fail or succeed on their own. And then if that has entailments, then it has entailments, and all the worse for those things that are entailed. Or all the worse for the things that are not entailed.
Yes.
But that's not even the case here. It is the case that the theism atheism debate is really separate from the dualism versus not dualism debate, which I think is cool because it kind of like allows for conversations like this to happen, where I think you and I are both probably not particularly married to like dualism in this, like, I don't think either of our lives would change drastically if all of a sudden we were like, oh no, actually I'm going to change my mind on this one. You know what I mean? And I just think that's cool. Dave's like, I don't know, my life would change really drastically.
If it tells you anything, my commitment to dualism is actually stronger than my commitment to Christianity. I would probably
Really?
give up. I think the evidence for dualism is stronger than the evidence for Christianity.
Well, okay, sure, but like the evidence that 2 + 2 is equal to 4, like you should believe that 2 + 2 equals to 4. Like you should believe that more than you should believe Christianity too. And I feel like that's.
Yes.
Huh. I was gonna say I feel like
It should be uncontroversial, but
that's
you've got that clip of that guy who's like, if the Bible said 2 + 2 = 5, I would believe it. So
I was just gonna say that I don't think it's controversial, and then I stopped myself because I was like, well, no, it might be
in some
controversial.
quarters.
Yeah, it depends what group you run in, but hey, man, this was awesome. I really appreciate you coming on and doing this show with me. I got a ton out of it. I'm sure that actually I know that the audience got a ton out of it because they're commenting how great it was, and it is. So Dave, this was awesome. Thanks again for coming on, and until next time. Okay, I just hit end.